All right. Well, I'm so grateful to have Dan here, Dan Andrews. We had the blessing to meet in Austin in person, but what's amazing about when you meet humans that do things that change the world is you get to have beautiful conversations both in the work you do and out. He's an author as well and writes what I found out over 1 million words on the internet out there in the world, which is mind blowing. So if you're working on writing your book and you're trying to get 500 words, just remember Dan. So grateful you're here. And I always love for you to just share one thing that makes you stand out in your world to other people.
Oh, wow, that's a question I haven't been asked before. There you go. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I've always been passionate about trying to discover what I think about things vis-a-vis writing. So I always think of the essay, the the idea that you're writing to seek to discover, and sometimes your words can either formulate like the blob that's in your head and give you a framework for understanding yourself or your world. And then sometimes you come across something that's exciting. And the most exciting moment is when what you've discovered turns out to be true for other people too. It was on the tips of their tongue. And when they read it, they can then apply it and take a different behavior or a different thought pattern because you put that out there. And
Yeah.
that to me is like the exciting part of writing and connecting with people in that more slightly more structured way. And I think is what drives me to publish online and to attempt to write when I have the time.
Yeah. I first learned about Dynamite Circle when I was in Lisbon, living there. Got invited to come with one of your members, and I was like, yeah, I'll come to the event, just check it out, hang out. What surprised me in a beautiful way is that everyone there was so generous with their time and effort and their experience to help that I kept looking on my shoulder like, what's going on here? But I think it I think it really emulates who you are and maybe the founders as well. But like the way you see the world isn't a zero sum game. You're always finding value in the other. Where does that come from? Where do you kind of get that disposition? Because so many people who are entrepreneurs trying to make money tend to push people into different pockets, but you seem to bring them all together.
Well, if we're thinking about writing specifically, I was an outsider to how to have a business, how to make money with your creativity. And there was this era of the internet when I was coming up that everybody locked that down and they were trying to extract from you. They wouldn't actually share with you what was actually happening. If you think in the early days of the Dan Kennedys of the world and all the internet marketers that he inspired were really about, if you really want to know the story, pay me a lot of money.
Right.
And that was the culture at the time and the writing online. And that was also the culture I encountered when I would go to meetups. When I would meet people in person, I felt like just like everybody was a shark and they were trying to extract something from you, trying to make sure you know something about them. And there was this underground culture that started to come up on the internet of the transparency movement where people were starting to share their journeys. This was happening like 07, 08, 09. I saw it a lot in podcasts where people would fire up some kind of microphone. I don't know what we had back then, but they would be like, I own an SEO agency. I live in Albany. I remember this one particular guy, and he's like, here's what I did today, and here's how I got my next client. And I was like, man, that's it. And then there was some more famous people. Maybe Seth Godin would be like a marketer who really showed you behind the scenes. The 37 Signals guys, they would write about their business. Here's how I'm doing it. I'm not, I'm giving you more information than the guy who's asking for $5,000.
Yeah.
And that really inspired me. Rob Walling came out of that movement, Startups for the Rest of Us, where he's like, this is what I did in my startup this week. And I called it the preacher. It's
Right.
like you're doing something, you're sharing it, and you're creating more net value for everybody. And that was, I think, the tradition that everything came out of. It's like we have many events every year, for example, and we never have a professional speaker. Never. We always just put somebody up there who has been working hard at their craft, whatever they're doing. We give them a speaker coach and we say, would you be willing to invest 20 hours of your time to share your story? And the reason is because it'll benefit a lot of other people. and you'll get to know people through this spirit of generosity and community. And then that will be a net positive, maybe not tomorrow, but in the long run. I feel like that's something that you can live with yourself, you can live with others, and it's just more fun in the end, I think.
Yeah. Well, couldn't agree more. And tell me, well, tell everyone, where were you before you started the entrepreneur journey? What was drawing you into taking creativity and applying it to this world?
Well, I felt in some ways when I had a cubicle and a job and a million spreadsheets and people from Fortune 500 corporations berating me via email and telephone calls, that in some ways, like, my life as a creative was over. I had this dream that I would maybe be a university professor, but I just couldn't cut it. And in that life of having to travel around to these small towns and publish all the time, and it just seemed like maybe there was something more in the money direction I could pursue. But then when I got to corporate America, and it wasn't even corporate America, it was just a small business, and it was pretty crushing.
Yeah.
And so I looked to the internet to find, other paths. And it really was these early internet marketers, people starting to share journeys of basically screwing around on the internet. Um, and at some point, the book that galvanized a lot of the folks in our community was The 4 Hour Work Week. And you mentioned to me that the message of the writing is often more important than the structure of the book, or what's the message. And one of the ways I've heard that described by Paul Graham, who writes essays, he said, what does the book actually whisper to you? What does it suggest to you?
Mm-hmm.
It might not say it outright. And to me, the 4 Hour Work Week said this to me. It said, you can quit your job, you can travel the world, and it might actually be smart. And that
Right.
might, I had to figure out if might was true for me. And so I started screwing around on the internet and started to find other people doing the same. And it's turned out to be a really good career in the end. And I did get to travel the world, and I do get to control my time and all those promises in the 4 Hour Work Week. It's not 4 hours a week, unfortunately. That part turned out to be untrue. But
Right.
but ultimately, I think that at that time and place, Tim Ferriss said something that was on the tips of everybody's tongues. And it's such a magical book for that reason. It wouldn't hit the same way if I read it now. But at that moment in time, it was a moment in time when so many of us had our first, like, kind of smartphones, and we had this, like, email culture where people were emailing you in the evenings and they expected you to respond. And you just started to feel like, wow, this digital world is really oppressive. And he was showing the other side of the coin. Well, maybe it could be empowering to us. Maybe those people that email you at 8 p.m. could be doing work for you instead of giving you work to do. And I think that that's part of the reason the book resonated so much with so many thousands, or at this point, hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of people.
Right. I remember that was definitely an important book for me reading and going, huh, that's interesting. Never thought of these things. Wasn't sure exactly what I would do, but then I started following Pat Flynn, and I liked his vibe. I liked his generosity, his authenticity. He seemed to be honest. Like, I was like, I think I can trust this guy. I don't really know, but as far as things go, and I started messing around. I started figuring things out. I just started with a book. It wasn't that was thoughtful. What I'll do is write a book, and then this will happen. I had no idea what would happen, but writing a book generated, lots of revenue over a decade and chance to speak on stages all over the world. And um, it's helped me, like, see myself differently. And I was a professor at the time. I was a principal and a teacher. Like, I had a very traditional path for 25 years. It wasn't like I just started and I was in it. So to pivot late in life with that sort of, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I know if he can do it, it's got to be possible for me. And that's basically what got me to take the leap and start thinking differently. And the arbitrage of making things happen in 4 hour work week was my last traditional role was in Shanghai. I think we talked about this, and I got a job there, but I got recruited. So I was able to have some sort of things I could hold over the recruiter, which was, I want my own office. I don't want to have a responsibility to any classes. I'll happily coach teachers and principals. I have a podcast. I want to still travel to make money at what I'm doing. Like I gave everything. And he's like, yes. I'm like, and pay for my housing and my travel and my daughter gets to go to school free. And it was just everything and everything. And they're like, yep. I'm like, oh, this is going to work out great. And that's how I started my business, is creating a way for me to have enough time to think. When you're a principal and professor and a teacher, you just have so little time, if you're doing a great job, to be free from thought. So that's how I kind of entered into it. And a book was my sort of my entry point, because people saw me differently because I was an author.
You're one great deal away from becoming an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
I can remember like these critical deals that come. And even I wrote a travel guide to Vietnam with no sense for, exploring buyer intention or price points or gross margins or market size, any of the stuff that you learn over time. I just did it. The number one competitor bought it the first day I put it up. And I was like, man, this is I realized in that moment it was a bad idea, but it was good that I did it, when you start these things and you go along. In fact, I remember um, Pat Flynn was one of the people that I met in the early days from that shark meetup that I told you about, that it turns out there was 3 dolphins there. There was 3 people who wanted to collaborate out of like a 40-person meetup. And the 4 or 5 of us ended up continuing to meet because we were sharing our ideas with each other versus just trying to sell people,
Yeah.
look at everybody as the next customer or whatever. And so I agree, like he was one of those early people who was being generous online. He was always careful with the way he promoted his products and always led with value. And that was a fresh thing when he published that first income report online. It's it's a really interesting way to think about being an author or creative too. Is there something that I'm willing to do or capable of doing that no one else is right now? And Pat found that in that moment, and he created an enormous audience from that one fundamental insight, along with a great work ethic and everything else.
Yeah. I think for some reason, and that might be true for everyone, but people have been really resistant to letting go of the idea of what a book is. I love Seth Godin's work because he challenges the idea that you even need chapters. He challenges the idea that it has to be long or that it has to be a certain way, and yet still hold the market for who he is. But what I realize is most people want to be told what to do. And in a book in particular, for this reason, we were trained in school to be editors, not writers, right? You were given a task. Here, you have this assignment. You have 6 weeks to do it. Turn it in. And you're like, okay, what's the grade? How do I know what my grade? Here's the rubric. Follow this. You'll get this grade if you do this, A, B, C, etc. So we edited ourselves to pass the class, get the test done, get the whatever,
Yeah.
right? So we weren't trained to be writers. And people are like, well, I took creative writing. I was like, yes, but you were trained to be an editor because you were taught grammar, punctuation, structure, style. Those are all editor tools. Great writers know the rules, but they break them all the time. And that's their job. Their job is to be sort of non-compliant to the status quo and say something worth saying, in my opinion. Some of you might disagree, but because we're trained to be editors, most people get stuck when I say, okay, write. They're like, but what do you want to write? I'm like, I'm not telling you what to write. But they're like, but well, how? I'm like, you know how. It's one word and then the other word. Well, how do I know it's going to be a book? I go, I don't. Well, but you, what? And they struggle with this. I go, oh, writers don't ask these questions. You're an editor. Stop being an editor. Let go of all this stuff that doesn't matter. That's really difficult for people. So most of my job is retraining people to let go of their editor brain and hang on to the creative brain, which doesn't have any rules or boundaries or doubts or fears. It just does. It does its thing. And most people are terrified because they weren't allowed to do that. So they don't know what would happen if they just didn't think about those things. And that's mainly what I have to do, is to help them divorce their brains, 2 halves of their brain, and make sure one doesn't participate when the other one's doing their work.
Well, I could speak from someone who's been on the other side of the fence, like, a lover of books and reading, like constantly reading, a lover of scribbling words here and there, and just wanting to be a part of it, but not really sure like what that writer brain is, like what is the methodology. Because like I know how I can write really good. I got good grades in school or whatever. I wrote for the newspaper, but like I want to be a part of this book thing, but I don't quite know how to think about it.
Yeah.
And maybe there are some interesting frameworks there. Like, one that's useful is to do something that is unique, to do something completely unique and then write about that. That's like the Mr. Beast style of making a YouTube video, but a lot of authors will do that too. It's like a Gonzo style, or to elevate a story that you believe is inspiring. So that's like a journalist approach. I will find a story that I, use your nose to find interesting. This is fascinating, needs to be told, or it's really popular with one audience, but there's another audience that needs to understand this story because it will inspire them. That's another example. And then yet another is this is very, could be useful to people that really want to get over the hump, is what if come up with a conference that you have to speak at and figure out what the big problem is in a room full of 100 to 1,000 people and write the speech for that conference. That's actually a really quick hack to, that's a book. That's a book right there. Can you throw yourself into solving a particular problem that those 500 people have, or one of the people in the back of the room? So those are some ideas I've used to catalyze writing over the
Yeah.
years. And then finally, essay is like, if you have a problem you're trying to solve, you search for the answers yourself. And there's many great books. Like one of my favorite books is Eat, Pray, Love. I know people in retrospect have criticized a lot about it, but I really enjoyed reading that book. And she was just trying to throw herself into solving this problem of like, I'm miserable, maybe travel will solve it, and that was her essay about those things. And I thought it was successful, and everybody else did too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I love the idea of like, imagine you're going to speak this in front of people, because I often will tell my authors that books aren't words, and they'll be like, I don't understand that. It seems like that's all books are. I said, well, the words are just the vessel. They're the thing holding the message together, and how you're delivering it. It's not the thing. The message is the thing. Like you said, the whisper, what's just underneath the surface of what you're saying that the reader's going to figure out for themselves. That message part, most authors aren't sure what it is. And then they get one that seems like, oh, I'll just write what I know. I go, do you really need to write that? Like, how is that going to help you? They're like, well, I can share it with others. My challenge is, but if a book doesn't transform you, you're not giving someone transformation, you're giving them information. And in the digital shift that we're making with AI, people aren't going to need you to give them information. They're going to ask their chatbot, and they're going to get it all from them, very succinctly tailored to them. But a message that shifts people's souls or their perspective or their hearts, or gives them courage, or makes them open up in a way they haven't, that isn't like a command. That's somehow a persuasive thing that has to occur. And usually if authors don't have it themselves, then what they're giving to people is something from the past that might have worked when you did it, but will it work now? How do you know? How do you know this is still here for you? And most of the authors I work with, they feel really uncomfortable with the idea of not knowing. They're like, but I need to know where I'm going. And go, like, you need to know what your kids are going to turn out like after when they're born. Is that what you mean? They're like, no, not like that. I go, but why is this different? And it's really hard for them. They want to control it. And I said, art, in my opinion, and that's what I think writing is art. It's creative first, has a notion of curiosity, and in curiosity is the unknown. And that's what I'm looking for in an author. What are you curious about that you don't know enough about yet?
Well, and there can be pain. You can see like professionals are quite good at this. Like one of my reading deep dives in the past 6 months really has been rock biographies. And when you read biographies, you can tell there's always a professional there sitting around like, give us the dirt, like tell us the thing that you don't want to say right now. And for me, that was the catalyst for my first book. It was for a very small audience. It's worth mentioning that previous to this, I had written hundreds of thousands of words that went to waste because I was trying to do these types of things that you're talking about. But there was this one moment in my life. We sold a business in 2015, and I was unhappy about it. And I was unhappy about it, how I handled it. I was unhappy about some of the outcomes. Yet in the business world, it's considered, one of the things that you go online and you brag about and you say, I'm going to exited my business, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't want to admit it either. And so I started writing about that. And what I discovered was that it turns out it's really common, but it's not something people communicate a lot. And
Yeah.
so my book became a discovery of this community of 50% of business owners find themselves miserable after they sell their businesses. And I started to find some allies in this, like, oh, wow, I'm not the only one. And then, well, maybe I could go back and write a book for myself. Like, how could I have approached it just a little bit differently? And anyway, that ended up being the book. And I think the impact has been incredible. The amount of phone calls and emails and people coming up to me and stuff. And I think it's in part because it was hard to say some of these things,
Yeah.
It wasn't just step 1, step 2, step 3, but I went into myself and sort of, you can imagine maybe Pat Flynn wasn't dying to share his income report online, but he
Yeah.
thought, well, man, this is, what people really want to hear about. And so
Yeah.
there's something to that as well.
I think that's brave. And I think you're right. Cause I talked to a lot of those founders who go, what am I supposed to do now? It's almost painful from my perspective, watching them go through it. Even if it went well, they have remorse. Like they're messing up my business, or they
Oh,
drove
yeah.
it in the ground, or the number of people who buy their business back. It's really, it's surprising. um, Tell about the book that you were sharing earlier, the one that's most recent, and why did you write that book?
The one that's in draft form, or
Sure, share the one that you were.
This is the first book. It's called Before
Yeah.
the Exit. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's for the thumbnail. I wrote that book because I needed to speak at a conference, and I didn't want to even admit to my business partner that I was like this kind of shameful idea that I had in my head, and so I just kind of pursued it and asked myself, like, well, what would a more experienced person, how would they have guided me? What do I know now that I didn't know then? And a combination of my own experience and other stories that I was able to dig up from speaking with people directly on the phone or reading their books or whatever. And so, one of the conventions that made it easy for me too is a book doesn't have to be 55,000 words. I didn't need to write 55,000 words to say what I needed to say about a very niche topic, and 5 simple thought experiments that I thought people could go through in order to formulate their ideas about exiting. And so, yeah, I think most of my writing starts with, a problem that I want to solve for myself or for a client, and just sitting down and grinding away at it for a little while. And it's interesting. Like the more, it's often, I find that like you'll write 10 or 20,000 or even more words, and it's really like finding a few key paragraphs and like that's the book, and you press into those few key paragraphs. What if you went on that journey right there?
Yeah.
Versus I think a lot of us start and we just sort of we have too broad of a scope versus really dialing into like that nugget of like, wow, that's really something there. What if you just hung out there for
Yeah.
30,000 words? And that's been useful to me as well.
Yeah. I love that, Dan. I think one of the things I try to encourage authors, that sounds like you've discovered, which is books are not big ideas. They're really small ideas. They might seem big. Atomic Habits might seem like a big idea. It's not. It's very, very small. It's small enough to pick up with your fingers and go, oh, I get it. And everything else in the book is to persuade you about that simple idea. And most people are looking for some idea that's either so unique or so obtuse. And I was like, you're unique already as a person. You don't have to find a unique idea. You just have to find the thing that most people just stepped over and didn't notice or didn't say. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's so true. I didn't notice that, but you're right. That's what you want in a book. It's a small idea that becomes a big idea because a lot of people are talking about it. That's what makes the idea more willing to talk about, because books are better to be talked about than they are to be read. And that might disappoint some authors to hear. But if I talk about your book,
Most books, yeah.
more powerful, because when people talked about Tipping Point when it came out, so many people didn't read it. The same with James Clear's book. So many people talk about it, they haven't read it or didn't finish it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's most of our books that sit on our shelves. We buy it, we start it, we don't finish. And that, don't be irritated by that as an author. Know that if the message is strong, them talking about it could really be that impactful. That one little nugget you talk about, That's the thing they're chewing on. So it's not a problem that it took them this long to get it. It only matters, do they get it when they're done, when they leave the book? Can they talk about it in a way that impacted them, that now they're not just reading a book and forgetting what was on page 12 of chapter 6, whatever, because they're
Yeah,
not going to remember that.
there's a velocity to, like, it's like the tip of the spear. There's a velocity to ideas that have a particularity and can be passed quickly. Like, one recently was, how many people on the internet read the founder mode essay or watched the 2-hour talk? Nobody needed to read it in order to understand what Brian was suggesting by founder mode. He's like,
Yeah.
forget about these outsiders trying to come in and tell us what to do with our business and tell us to grow up and everything. There's a real power to being in founder mode, and we
Yeah.
didn't need to go read the back, and a certain percentage of us will go and trace down where that idea came from. But I do like that concept of focusing on the particular and understanding that the narrowness of the idea itself can be what makes it penetrate,
Yeah.
just like an arrowhead.
Yeah, great analogy. And what happens with it, if it sticks with them. They take it wherever they go. Think about the books you talk about. The ones where I love the way Seth Godin thinks, at least the way he's described it, is he come up with the idea of a title sometimes and then buy the domain, and then the book will come later because it's the idea he's latching onto. Purple Cow, for example, or something like that. I think sometimes those ideas strike you and you're like, but it's not time for this book. Good. Well, then let that beautiful idea sit and even grow. But don't think that dumping words on top of it's going to make it better. It's not. It's dusting away the words that makes it better. It's letting it be less than you think. It's really difficult. But what I learned from young people when I was teaching writing to students is that they have a hard time finding the small, simple thing. But when they do, it's miraculous. It's a miraculous moment for them and for the reader. And that moment only happens in creation, in my mind. I don't know that it happens necessarily. Let me think about it now and then. It happens sometimes. If you're a Seth Godin, maybe you have magic powers like Seth.
Well,
He
I have a methodology for you, which Kevin Kelly said something one time. He said, if your environment is sufficiently rich, the process of creativity becomes indistinguishable from discovery. And so, one toolkit that an author could use is simply to discover a great idea. And I can think of a few off the top of my head that I'm currently fascinated by, where many people that express themselves for a whole career or whatever, or are doing it now, they don't have this ability to recontextualize an idea, to simplify it, to explore it in interesting ways. Maybe they are a scientist, maybe they are a psychologist, maybe they are some weird blogger on the internet. You can do the world a great service by simply discovering the idea. Like, for example, one of the ideas that our entire community echoes and has been picked up all around and aggregated out of our community has been something called the 1,000-day principle. And I was at a pool party with a good friend of mine, one of the most talented entrepreneurs I know. And we were in Bali at the time. And I was just like, why doesn't everybody just quit their jobs and join us in Bali? This makes so much sense. Let's do this. Or why doesn't everybody do this? And he ended up telling me about this concept called the 1,000-day principle, which is that in order to start a business, you'll have to make less than you would make at a professional job in your business for 3 years. And most people aren't willing to go for 3 years making less money. So that's the 1,000-day principle. And he just said it to me. We were drinking some beers, hanging out at a pool party. And I thought, man, that's really something. And
right.
and so I always give David McKeegan the credit for the idea, but he wasn't going to write it. He's at a pool party. So I went and I spent, the next few years exploring this idea and finding examples of it and seeing how people violated it and were they data points for the idea, what was their take on it. And it ended up being an idea that was really empowering and brought a lot of people together because they saw themselves in the sacrifice. And then people would say, well, I'm on day 275 and here's what I think would typically happen in this. So it grew from there. But it was one
Yeah.
simple concept of, we all sacrificed money in the short term to start a business. And here's about how long that took. And I think before David came along, no one was really willing to say what that time frame, what the expectations could be for a founder. And so there's an example of simply discovering something in your environment that you find interesting, the reality is most people in life are living life. They are not taking the time to write about it. It's like does the victor write history? And it's like, no, I disagree. The person who took the time to write the history writes the history. And the reality is, as an author, you are in the extreme minority of people in your everyday life who are willing to write the history. And so I think that that is the superpower of the author, is you can simply discover things and tell the story of them. And that's a service, I believe, it fundamentally. And
Yeah.
so it doesn't need to come from, a rumination at a some retreat or banging your head against your computer for days on end. It often helps to go simply look around, read books, identify things. There's so many classic blogs, long form pieces on the internet, scientific research that just sits quiet, but it's waiting for someone to discover it, and that's the author's job.
Yeah. I totally appreciate that. I might disagree with you about the victor and the history part because you're a white man with power. But I
I'll
will
take
say,
that.
I will say that that I think the creativity zone is in this present moment. It isn't going to be locked in your mind. Let me think about the great idea. It doesn't come from that. It comes from this living thing you're talking about. Creativity is in this zone of curiosity, which doesn't have an answer to it yet. It might have a germination of what it is. And I tell that to people because the TED talk I gave that has ridiculous amounts of views, I didn't have anything to do with it. It just decided it wanted to do that. But it came from a failed book proposal. I was like, this sucks. My proposal says this is not good. So I was like, well, I thought this was a good book idea. He's like, no. But this one little thing, what kids say, what makes a good teacher, that thing's interesting. Chase that. And I was like, I don't want to write this 30, 40, 50-page book proposal again. So I got invited to do a TED talk on, let me practice here. Like you said at a talk, let me see if this sticks. Does this thing have anywhere to go? Do I care about it? Do I think it's interesting? And even though I haven't written that as a book to its completion, I find that that idea of curiosity and unknowing moment for me brought about the most impact for the people that listened to that TED talk, and has for me too, because I realized, oh, it was just something I didn't notice either until that moment.
Well, and there's two elements to it. We're like exploring this idea of discovery, but now you're gesturing towards this concept of volume. And I think it's really important too when people, clutch their pearls with their big book idea and stuff like this. We were talking about off air, really famous authors like Mark Manson and James Clear, and people who had tons of success, Pat Flynn. They all of their Let's talk about this thing called the equal odds theory, which is an observation that I read from a blogger many, many years ago. His name is Sebastian Marshall. He pulled up this observation that many people have had, which is that the scientists, the only way you could predict if a scientist had a most cited paper, so a most popular paper, was the volume of papers they had produced. And so the equal odds theory suggests that you don't know the ideas that you have that are going to resonate with others until you put them in front of people. And so when you look at someone like James Clear or Mark Manson, who've both written spectacularly successful books, they're putting out blogs, like 2 or 3 blogs a week, newsletters every week, and people latch on to something. I had no idea that people would care about the 1,000 day principle, but it's a great title for a book if I ever wanted to go for one. You just keep putting stuff out. So if you can do anything that's more fractal and high volume, this seems like a very reliable way to make a much more like impact with your writing. Is just get it out there in front of an audience, and it's going to be a small percentage. We see the same framework happen with business ideas, that in fact, it turns out that about 5% of them actually work. Or, the American populace has been given the statistic that 1 out of 10 or only 9 out of 10 small businesses fail. So most people would say, well, like starting a business is like really risky. But if you take the equal odds theory, it's like, well, just start 10 businesses.
Right. You will win.
It's the same thing with, I think, ideas and books. It's like, well, just get a bunch in front of people. And, you might say, well, I'm not that interested. And this is kind of a magical moment that happens as an author. Because I think in the beginning, we undervalue this piece, which is to say you have an idea that you're like, oh, it was kind of a thing. I put it out. Well, 100 people write you an email about it. And it's like, you might look at that idea a little differently now, because now you have a purpose and a service, which is, well, these 100 people are getting a lot out of this idea. Maybe I can take a second look at it and find something to pursue here, and this is how a lot of authors' journeys go. I'm writing for the audience. And I think there's a real power in that. It can be two sides of that sword as well. It can cut both ways. But I think it can drive a lot of creativity when you know that there's a purpose to what you're doing and that you want to do a great job. It's a constraint.
Yeah.
Constraints can be really good in the creative process.
Oh, I think they're absolutely necessary, right? Like get an oil painter and hand them some pastel or hand them some charcoal, and it creates a new expression of something because the limitations change. Doesn't mean they'll be better or worse at it. It just is a restriction. And I try to tell that to authors, like, what if your book was a one sentence story? They're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, I used to do it with authors that were kids because I never graded kids on how long their work was. And one kid, maybe this was you if you're listening. He's like, so if I write a sentence, like I could get an A. I go, if it's worth an A and you follow the process we all do. Yeah. He's like, sweet, I'll just write a sentence. And I was like, no, we're all going to write it to the class. Everyone, stop what you're doing right now. We're going to write one sentence stories. You have 45 minutes. I'll check in. And when you think you're done, bring it to me and we'll read it aloud. And that kid was kind of perturbed because he was like, this is my thing. I was just going to write one sentence. And he realized it was extremely difficult to write a one sentence story. But they started doing it and it was blowing my mind what they were able to write in one sentence. Like the classic one is baby shoes for sale, never worn, that kind of simplicity. And so they were emulating these really powerful notions as a sentence.
That's
and
so cool.
That's what I want authors to do, like push and pull on this idea. If it were one sentence, what would your book be about?
This is why the speech framework works so well, because if you have a bad story, you will bomb in front of those people. If you don't consider your audience, you will bomb. If you like all these things, if you don't express yourself clearly, you will bomb. And so a book has the same theoretical, constraints, but we don't often see them. And I think part of the reason for it is I do think that there is a strong escapism motivation to be a writer. And so the question is are we going to leverage that idea that, we want to be freer from the world, we want to be more creative, we don't want people to judge us as much. It's a place to get lost and to be safe. And this is the type of writing that, is easy to fantasize about, but it's often where that's the mode we get stuck in when things aren't working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I share that, and so I understand. I feel that like I could just write, sit on an island somewhere, and there's no constraint to this type of thing because everything's allowable all of a sudden. And if what you want is your words to have an impact, it's probably not a good strategy.
Yeah. And I authors are afraid to share their work. I'm like, share your work. That's how you know whether or not it's a good conversation to be having. Do you want to have conversations with people if you're writing this, or are you just doing it in isolation and you think, well, when it's good, I'll give it to people, or when it's ready, or if it's good, they'll find it. If it's good, they'll leave good reviews. I go, that's all a garbage. I don't know where you got that from. That's not true. I really think it's important for people to understand that your audience matters. I probably 2012, I saw a post that one of my friends had for, hey, we're looking for speakers for a moth style talk, and we have moth coaches coming in. We'll coach you if you're interested. For this particular event, it was for LGBT community coming out, and like I said, oh, I have a story to tell. So I raised my hand and I said, I'll do it. And because I was like, I get to learn from these moth storyteller experts,
right?
Because that's a awesome 5-minute story. 5 minutes is really, TED Talk's hard. It's 18 to 24, but 5 minutes, and then they're judging you, and then you get a critique. Like, that's serious. And And they give you like one word or sentence to work with, and you don't know if you're going to speak that night. You have to wait till your name's called, if it's called. So you have to be prepared either way. It's a really incredible, challenging type of thing. So of
Absolutely.
course I went and I flew out there, and I don't think he thought it was in Brooklyn and I was in San Diego. He goes, I said, I don't really know the area. He goes, wait, where are you in New York? I go, oh no, I'm in San Diego. He's like, wait, you volunteering to come do this? He goes, you have to come for like a rehearsal and weekend and work on your story and then fly back the next week to give your story. I said, I'll do it. I'm like, you're giving to me this for free. But what I learned from that was invaluable, because you get immediate feedback as to whether or not what you're saying resonates, and good or bad, you get it. And I think that's what writers need. They need more of a put it out there, share your thought, be curious. I'm on 8 years in October for my podcast. That's a long time for me
It's a
to
long
do
time.
anything. I think I'm just getting started. Like, I think I'm just getting good enough to enjoy the process in new ways, because most of mine have been interviews, which is, different. And I've just started doing solo shows, which are a whole nother medium to
I
hold
listened
the
to your last
attention.
solo show. It's really good. You
Oh,
have,
thank you.
yeah, you have a great voice for podcasting. First off, but your pacing, your choice of words, yeah, it's a harder format.
Oh gosh, I didn't know that, because I actually hadn't done it. I hadn't done it for 300 episodes, so it was really new. I only did it if a guest didn't show up or something. I didn't do it with intention.
Well, I
But
think it's useful for your audience too, because they want to hear from you now, because
yeah,
they want to
that's
hear
what people have
about
told me.
you. Yeah.
Tell us what you're doing. What's going on with you? I want to know what you have to say. Not that they don't love this interaction, but I found that interesting, because I thought, oh, I didn't know that they cared that much. And I just created I'll happily drop the link here or give it to you. It's a solo show called Born to Write, Scared to Start, because most of the people listening have been listening for years but haven't done a thing. Most people out there, the biggest thing I work with authors for the first several weeks, sometimes months, has nothing to do with writing, because there are all these blocks that they build in themselves, that they create stories and they really make them true. Like writer's block is a thing. Yeah, I got writer's block. I always see writer's group. Yeah, I had writer's block
What is
today. I'm
that the
like,
most common one?
no, no. The most common one is really simple. I don't know where to start. And I usually say with the first word, and they get really upset. I'm like, honestly, it's not going to change. The first word is where you start, but you have to get through the other things that you're attaching to this idea, which is, what if it's no good? What if my peers think it's awful? What if no one reads it? What if I don't have the right voice? I'm not really a writer. All these list of things. And that's what I address in that secret podcast. Is most of what I'm helping people do is let go of their beliefs, so that this really creative, curious person shows up for themselves. But they want to be certain it's going to be good, or certain it's right, certain I know what I'm doing. I'm like, oh, I can't help you with that. That's what I used to do as a professor. I gave them the rubric and this is the structure, but that's not what writers do. Writers really wrestle with the same thing every day. They sit down and they write despite it. So I'm learning more and more about how to help people that are really wanting to do the work.
That is one framework that, getting back to Tim Ferriss, that he talked a lot about in the process of writing 4 Hour Workweek, that could be useful to someone in that situation, which is to say, kind of ties it together a little bit. Write for one person. So you have an avatar in your mind. So it's not pure creative expression. That's the framework of your life. That's your identity. That's something different. But we're talking about the word, the first word that Azul wants us to write. So who am I writing it to? And so maybe, for example, you recently, like last year, went on a diet and your friend didn't go on a diet. And, you know, you both know about the diet. So what was it about that you saw in that inspired you, and you could tell that story to that person? Like, here's why this resonated with me. So, just something simple like that. Like, here's one person that I would love to hear this message in a new way. And that could
Yeah,
get you over the hump. I feel like often I will do that. I will think of one person and say, here's something I discovered that I would love for you to hear about.
I love that. I use that strategy for the authors all the time. I say, if it's hard for you to do that naturally, because you're so trained as an academic writer or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
is to write Dear Sally, and then to
Yes.
write it and then erase Dear Sally later. But no one knows you're writing to Sally. It feel like you're writing to them, but that's the tool. It's so simple. It's such a simple hack. You don't have to even think about it once you start writing Dear Sally. You just talk to them
It could
directly.
even be yourself in a different time.
It could be. It could be. Yeah.
2 years ago,
Dear
5 years.
knucklehead. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think often it is. And so that's why I say give a persona to it so that you can talk directly to the person. You understand who they are, what they're doing, why they're stuck, where they're at. Maybe you're making some assumptions, sure. But if you do that, it feels like people, you're like, wow, they get me. And the more you know about their fears, not their just their challenges, but their secret fears, the one they're not telling you about, the one that says, but my dad said I'd be nothing if I wasn't an accountant. That fear, that's the one you address by saying, I know you think that if you do this, you're going to be seen as a failure. And they're like, oh my God, is he looking? How does he know this? When you talk like that to the person, they assume you have the answer because you see them so deeply. And with that Dear Sally, or the way you described writing to one person, they're assuming you're the one person that they're talking to. Really great.
I love that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you want to share any before we go, any of your project that you have coming up. Maybe you will, that you're writing.
There was just this one idea that I had where, I think it's so magical that your audience is asking for you to talk alone because you have attempted time and time again over 8 years to solve our problems as listeners. Now there's this reciprocal relationship where it's like, I just kind of want to hear what you had for breakfast too. You know what I mean? Like, because there's something then about the particularness of who you are when you share it. Somehow it gives context for all the other ideas and guests and concepts that you've been sharing. And I can think of when some of my favorite authors and podcasters have just talked about themselves and how, what a gift it was just to hear their story. There's this one podcaster, he's a sports podcaster. It's kind of wild, but his name is Bill Simmons. He's very popular now, but he's always told great stories, and he always did it in wacky ways where he connected movies and pop culture, and he's very creative. And I always thought it was interesting. And there was this remarkable podcast he had some years ago where his guest was like Matt Damon or something. And he opened up with 12 minutes of him responding to the Celtics losing to whatever team they lost to. And for me, it was this podcasting moment where he made the right decision to have Matt Damon at minute 13 because we wanted to hear what Bill Simmons thought about the freaking Boston Celtics. And I do think when you start to develop an audience by solving their problems, by entertaining them, whatever it is, then all of a sudden you might get that privilege to sit down and say whatever you think about anything, because there's that relationship there where now it is deeply fascinating to hear what you had for breakfast and what you think about the game last night, because I've heard you, I trust you, I just want some context for where it's all coming from.
Yeah.
And so
that's so helpful, Dan. I don't think anyone's ever told me that. Maybe they've said that, sort of listeners have said something like that, but I didn't totally get it until now. I appreciate that.
Well, one thing you could do is, like, for an interview like this, where I'm just this random dude showing up, in the future, you could move to putting an essay in front of it that's 1 to 15 to 25 minutes where you're reflecting on some of the things that you thought about after the interview or whatever it is you're curious about that day, so that people who are coming here for you, they get that fix,
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, now I'm willing to explore whoever this Dan guy is or whatever. And so that could be an adjustment.
I get to do that.
Yeah.
I get to do it for this podcast because I didn't do an intro.
Yeah,
that might change everything. I have actually, before we
here's what I had
here,
for breakfast before I talked to Dan.
I might actually do that, Dan. I was working on an episode that I'm putting out this week for my interview with Pat Flynn and his new book, and I really want to talk about why it matters. I don't think people really totally understand that I was a school teacher sitting on my floor thinking I need to change my life, and how important it was that I met that in person, and that writing a book was the way I thought I could get there. Like, what if I just write a book? Because I don't have a business. I don't even have a business idea. But if I wrote a book, at least I could come there with an idea. It's an interesting story about how I decided, and it was based on one of my students in my class that challenged me. I was like, crap, I can't, like, this 12-year-old kid's challenging me in a good, beautiful way. I think I'd like to tell that story, because then it would lead up to why having Pat Flynn on there is not just a small thing for me. It's the reason why they're listening to me at all.
And I think that would do the interview such a great service that it comes in 6 minutes or 8 or 12, because now all of a sudden I'm identifying through you, your experience, what happened when you listened to Pat Flynn or were exposed to him. So now my opportunity to have the same experience you had. Here he comes, this guy that changed my life. Now it's all teed up for me to explore it for myself. I think that could be very successful.
I think, what's interesting about that is that I never intended to do any of this book writing stuff for anybody else. I wrote that book, The Art of Apprenticeship, for myself because I was like, I have to be able to get out of being I'm smart enough so that I could make a living online, but I don't know how. I'm going to just become someone's apprentice, someone's servant in this world, not a mentor, because mentors apply a lot of doing by the mentor. I want to be an apprentice. So that's why I wrote it. And I just conjectured that maybe if I do it right, Pat Flynn, the guy I'm aiming for, something will happen. And then he had an event. It was just like this serendipitous sort of synchronicities that started to occur. And I walked away from that event becoming his book coach. I didn't have a business. I don't know how that happened. It was magical. It was spontaneous. It was interesting.
Well, you didn't need to do that. You were extremely humble at that time because you were big shot at that time, and you had to take a step back to be an apprentice. I just have to highlight, I think being an apprentice is a secret to life, because the masters like Pat Flynn, their knowledge is so valuable and often not underappreciated by others too. So if you're willing to serve them, they can pay you in knowledge. It's worth its weight in gold. I think too few people pursue the apprenticeship path, and it might be for the similar kind of psychological reasons that you point to with authors. It's perhaps ego, and I think that's one of the cool things about writing. At the end of the day, is you can be the best writer in the world, but a blank Google Doc is still a blank Google Doc, and it's the same challenge every time. And there's something humbling about that. And so I want to underline that. I love that, the challenge, the consistency of the challenge, but also I'm so in on apprenticeships as a way to learn know-how, not just knowledge, because a book will teach you knowledge, but know-how is how that knowledge flows through your body and your actions. And that's reading my book about selling your business is a very different set of knowledge than selling a business.
Yeah. That's a good point.
It's like Seth Godin said, reading a book about riding a bike, right? It's not, do you know how to ride a bike if you've read a book about how to ride a bike?
Yeah.
Maybe. You'll probably still fall.
And that's why I'm a little concerned about schooling in general. But I think that what you're saying is true. I always say that I have influence, not because of the number of followers, but because I see service as influence. Service equals influence. I serve. And that's what apprenticeship's about, is in service. It's in service of the master. Now, people don't need to get all bent out of shape out of that word. Just know that the context is serving the person you're trying to learn from.
Yes.
So I taught that in very specific ways in that book and then applied it. And that's what happened. I wrote a book. I decided to show up. I served Pat's audience because he noticed me serving his audience. I showed up. This one thing I'll say before we go. It was held in San Diego. It was a one-day event. I didn't know this. I bought the ticket because I was so excited. I saw that he was in town giving something. Him and Chris Ducker, and I bought the thing with my credit card when I didn't have the money, but I went. And I realized when they send you intake form, hey, what's your email list? What's your business? What's your business model? What are your upsells? I was like, holy crap! I don't even have an idea. Let alone any of that stuff. So I go, what am I going to do? And that's when I wrote that book in 30 days and said, this idea, I'm going to apply this idea to this event and talk about the book that I wrote to do it. And when I reached out to Pat and Chris, I said, is there a meetup event the night before? Because I know there's some people flying in from Europe for this. They're like, Pat said, oh, no, there isn't. I said, I'd be happy to host it and organize it if you wouldn't mind. He's like, that would be awesome. And he goes, here's the email list. Here's when they're coming in. He's like, so I said, I'll arrange where, I'll make it close to the event. He's like, awesome. Thank you so much. And he's like, so should I pay for the appetizers? And so what time should Chris and I get there? And in my heart, I was like, oh, I really want to meet this guy. I was like, Pat, you can't come. He's like, what? I said, if you come, they're going to focus on you. The event is to make them feel more comfortable about each other. He's like, that's right. That's right. That's so much better. So even though it was hard to tell him not to come, what happened is I knew everybody there because I had emailed them. I checked on them. Did they need to ride from the airport? I was taking that on as a role. And the event, more than half of the people came to that meetup. So the day we show up to the event, everybody knew who I was. They're like, he was like, they know you better than they know me. I think all of those acts of service and acts of apprenticeship is what made it possible for when I did tell my story about that I wrote a book in 30 days about apprenticeship and I'm here. They all wanted to know, how did you do it? Who are you? How do we make this happen? And I coached 3 or 4 of those 6-7 figure entrepreneurs from that group because of that.
There you go.
So
it's brilliant.
Dan, this has
That
been a
is the way.
pleasure. That is the way. This is the way, as we Star Wars nerds. Where would we turn to find more about you? Of course, I'll share where I'm finding about you. We're sharing this together, so we'll maybe be redundant for our own community. But
yeah, tropicalmba.com if you'd like to learn more. We talk about making money on the internet, basically, from anywhere in the world. A lot of travel nerds, essentially.
Yeah. A lot of generous, warm human beings too. And of course, you can always find me at Authors Who Lead. The Secret Podcast, Born to Write, but scared to start. I'd be happy to share that. It's really great.
Very cool. Azul, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
All righty.